I've heard comments from you about, the war in Ukraine, certainly that make me wonder what your perspective is on that, right? Like, in other words, like, is it possible or desirable for the left to sort of keep an independent perspective that is opposed to escalating U.S. intervention in the world with all the horrible things that that's going to lead to, and so often has led to, but does so without sort of falling into, support for whoever the U.S. happens to be in opposition to, if that question makes sense to you?
Yeah, of course it makes sense to me, because I came from a generation where it was U.S. imperialism was the enemy of humankind, and you support anyone against U.S. imperialism wasn't really even a tough question. There were a couple of exceptions in my generation. One exception was, of course, Israel, which was a U.S. ally, and the Arab world is part of the third world. Yet many people on the left were going to support the U.S. in regard to the state of Israel. That's changed quite a lot. But that was one exception. But in general, if you're a person of the left, you were going to be hypercritical of what was called, accurately in my opinion, U.S. imperialism. Now things have changed very dramatically. I would say this is the first time in my lifetime that there is no left critical of U.S. policy towards in the context of the war in Ukraine. When I say critical, I'm not saying necessarily condemnatory. I'm saying there is no criticism at all. There's not even on the large parts of the left, actually virtually the whole left, there are marginal exceptions. There is not even a willingness to hear out criticism. So to take the most obvious example, there would, of course, even among liberals, there would have been some congressional hearings in which a variety of witnesses would speak to the conflict at hand. So why hasn't the so-called left in Congress just called for a hearing on Ukraine? You don't have to agree with John Mearsheimer. You don't have to agree with Jeffrey Sachs. You don't have to agree with these eminently mainstream people. We're not talking about wild leftists in the wings. We're talking about solid mainstream people. Just a hearing. No hearings. It's really, I never experienced something like this. I never thought was even, I never could conceive it. Nowadays, when I want to hear the latest dissenting opinions on Ukraine, I turn into this guy, Colonel McGregor, who's, I think, a pretty right-wing person, but very critical of the war in Ukraine. I listen to John Mearsheimer, who I count as a friend, but he would be the first to say he's quite conservative in his politics. He's a graduate of West Point. He's an advocate of what he calls realism in politics. This is not a wild-eyed leftist. He's a very nice guy, and he's been very kind and generous to me. But leftist, he's not. And Jeffrey Sachs is just a solid liberal. He has on his conscience that he destroyed the Soviet Union during the Yeltsin years, and probably has maybe 40 million corpses in his skeletons in his closet because of the advice he gave to Yeltsin, which Yeltsin dutifully followed. But he's a solid scholar for sure. He was a wunderkind at Harvard at age 28, I guess. He was already a star. So you don't even invite them to a hearing?
Yeah, so I wonder if there's a distinction here.
Whenever Bernie or AOC get a criticism on their Ukraine, their blind support, what do they say? Quote, who's paying you? Who's paying you? It can only be somebody who's being paid that might have questions about sending $100 billion to the Ukraine with not even a congressional hearing.
So I wonder if there's a distinction to be made here about the left in the sense of elected politicians who are somewhat aligned with the left, although often very disappointing, and the left in the sense of like, Jacobin magazine or Current Affairs or like DSA even, as an organization, that they have a like, because I do see a lot more criticism of Ukraine policy from those quarters, right? From people like Branko Marcetic, who writes all the time about it in Jacobin. We could also add people like, obviously Noam Chomsky, leftists don't get much more prominent than that, who's been, extremely critical of American and Ukraine policy. So it does seem like there are very critical voices on the left. But what I do agree with is that those voices do not have an echo in the halls of Congress. I think there's overwhelming pressure for people to shut up about that, and unfortunately, I don't know that the left, such as it is in the United States, is so weak. I don't know that it's in much position to impose pressure in the other direction.
Well, first of all, I would have to quarrel with you a little bit, a quibble rather than quarrel.
Yeah.
Quibble with you. You named Branko Markovic and you mentioned Noam Chomsky. I would add Aaron Mate. And I would still say you can count them all on the fingers of one hand. I still think you can count them all on the fingers of one hand. That's not a great showing. The second point is, I'm not forcing people, coercing people, demanding of people that they agree with me. I recognize that people can agree to disagree on a certain range of issues. I do not think it's within reasonable grounds to quarrel with the fact that Russia for 30 years, since the era of Gorbachev, has constantly been stating, stop this NATO expansion. Stop this NATO expansion. I thought that we were going to now create a confederation of Europe. What is with this NATO expansion? And that Russia has, for 30 years, tried to find a reasonable diplomatic resolution of the problems in Ukraine. Where people differ is whether Russia, having been systematically and methodically rebuffed for 30 years, and as facts were changing on the ground towards fully integrating Ukraine de facto into NATO, whether a threshold had been crossed such that Russia had the right to attack, versus those who say, yes, it's true, Russia was provoked, but the provocations weren't of a significant enough magnitude as to justify a Russian invasion. So there, I would say, between their position and my own, which is they had the right to attack, yes, I could say reasonable people can disagree. I have not written any of them off. However, you use the expression whether the people in Congress had sufficient heft, power, whatever you want to say.
Sorry, Norm. I just want to interrupt you because that's not quite what I said. What I said was that the grassroots left isn't in a position to exert much pressure on politicians. So in other words, that I think that politicians, I think, are often buffeted from different directions. Ideally, they're tools that that like we can get them to do things that we want.
I agree with that, but nothing prevented them from calling for hearings.
No, look,
nothing prevented
if the question is, would it have been better if
they had congressional hearings on Twitter?
Sure,
they could have had hearings.
So if the question is, would it have been better if there were hearings? Then I agree with you. Where I would, I think, maybe not just quibble, but perhaps even quarrel, is on two questions I'd like to separate, right? Because I think there's one of them that we agree on and one of them we disagree on. So I think the one that we agree on is there a very big problem with like United States policy toward the war in Ukraine? Was NATO expansion a bad idea? Is current U.S. policy not doing anything to do peace negotiations, but instead just pouring more and more money into the conflict?
And sabotage peace
does that make escalation to potentially terrifying levels more likely? All of that stuff, I think you and I agree on. I think that what we do disagree on is the justification question. In other words, that you could say that as a separate issue from whether U.S. policy towards Russia and Ukraine was justified, you could say, was Russia justified in invading Ukraine? And I would just posit that, if we imagine a directly, as parallel a situation as we can come up with, that there was like there was a civil war in Mexico, and there were like American-backed separatists who were on one side of it, and then there was like a leftist government in Mexico City that wanted to join the Warsaw Pact on the other side of it, and that even though it hadn't officially joined, it seemed like it might one day, and it was becoming more integrated with the Eastern Bloc. Under those circumstances, might the U.S. invade? Yeah, I think it might invade, but you and I would be marching in anti-war protests. We would be opposed to that.
Before I spoke with you this evening, I spoke with Glenn Greenwald.
Yep.
And of course, the question of Ukraine came up.
Yeah.
And everybody makes this analogy. And as I said to Glenn, and now I'm going to say to you,
sure,
the question is, does the analogy work?
Mm-hmm.
So let's take the case of Mexico or the comparable case of Canada, either of the countries in our border.
Mm-hmm.
Has the United States ever had to deal with an invasion from Mexico? Has Mexico ever invaded the United States?
So if it had, would that be sufficient to justify?
Let's just go through the basic questions to see whether the analogy holds up. Did Mexico ever invade the United States?
So given that it hasn't,
okay.
You think that's enough to show?
Hasn't, okay?
Yeah,
now,
I mean, it hasn't, but they have
let's telescope the whole question. Let's turn to Russian historical memory.
Mm-hmm.
Russian historical memory of the 19th century. You take Tolstoy. He's
mm-hmm.
writing a novel at the end of the 19th century. It comes to be called War and Peace.
Mm-hmm.
He wants to conjure the soul of the Russian people. What does he choose for the subject matter of his novel, his great novel? He chooses the War of 1812, the
mm-hmm.
French invasion of Russia. That's what weighs most on the historic memory of the Russian people from the 19th century. Let's go to the 20th century. What's the great memory of the Russian people of the 20th century? The Great Patriotic War. Mm-hmm. What's the Great Patriotic War? The Nazi invasion that wipes out, at minimum, 27 million Russian people. 27 million is not a trivial figure. The United States lost about 400,000 soldiers in World War II. Great Britain lost about 400,000. Altogether, about 800,000. Just in the Battle of Leningrad, what's called the 800 Days, the Siege of Leningrad. There was a famous book by Harrison Salisbury, the foreign editor of the New York Times, called The 800 Days. Just in the Battle of Leningrad, just one city, about, the estimates are 1.5 million people were killed.
Mm-hmm.
1.5 million, that's twice the total casualties of the US and UK during World War II. That's the memory that weighs on the Russian people. Now you might say, what do you know? The Russian people, what do you know? I'll tell you how I know. I'm pushing 70. Vladimir Putin is 70 years old. He's my age cohort. If time allows you, and if you want to, use it later in the broadcast, because I don't want to detain you now, you go to Wikipedia. You enter the name Vladimir Putin, and then they have it broken up into sections, and one section is called childhood. Okay, the whole childhood. Look at it yourself. Fortunately, your viewers can just check me after they hear my remarks. The whole childhood is about one thing. One thing. Relatives killed during World War II. That's it. About the father, about the mother, about the brother, about the sister. That's it. That's how they remember. That's how Putin remembers. And guess what? That's how I remember World War II. Because that's all, as I said to you already a half hour ago, that's all we talked about at home. That's the only memory. And so now, what do the Russian people see? What does the Russian government see? Not just Putin, the whole government. What do they see? They see a Ukraine which has an oversized Nazi presence in it, in the army and in the government. They like to call neo-Nazi. I don't know what neo-Nazi is. I know Nazi. They have an oversized Nazi presence in their armed forces, in their government. They see that this government, which came to power in a coup, which was backed by the United States, they see that government allied with a hostile military bloc. They see this hostile military bloc moving step by step, closer to the Russian border. And they see weapons being poured in, advisors being poured in. They see joint military exercises between the Ukrainian government and this hostile military bloc called NATO. And they see that it's only a matter of time before there are nuclear-tipped missiles within 5 minutes range of Moscow on their border. Now, why do I go through all this? Because I began by saying, I don't think your analogy with Mexico works, because I don't see any comparison between what the Russian people experienced in the 19th and then the 20th century and what Mexico experienced. Yes, once in a while, the United States has invaded Mexico. That's true. And the United 2/3 of Mexico was annexed by the United States. That's true. That part, yes. But what does that have to do with comparing the threat of Mexico to the United States with the threat of NATO against Russia? I don't.
Well, I mean, I think if that's a disqualified disanalogy, I think that the fact that Ukraine has never invaded Russia, would be disqualifying for a lot of the historical argument. I would also point out that if we're just sort of endorsing nationalist narratives based on historical memory, then Ukrainians too have been traumatized by the experience of World War II. Absolutely. And so you could equally say, if you're talking about Ukraine, Ukraine's government, wanting to have the protection of a larger military bloc, having that collective memory of invasion by a hostile power, I think has is going to feed into that also.
Okay, Ben. First of all, I have to shut up and let you speak, so I have to be careful about that. So I want you to complete your thought. It's totally unfair for me to dominate. Is your thought complete?
Well, the thought was just that they have that I don't think that the fact that there is a nationalist narrative that makes some internal sense here on one side, I don't think that's dispositive. I think there's actually a very similar national narrative on the other side of the war that makes a lot of sense internally. And I also think that I also think that the left should be should be skeptical of nationalist narratives in general. That I think that there's a value to maintaining an independent perspective, and especially when we're talking about a war that is, let's remember, launched by the handpicked successor of the people who destroyed the Soviet Union and imposed all of that shock therapy that you're talking about, that that involves massive death by working class Russians who are drafted, in many cases tried to flee to other countries to avoid being drafted to fight in the war. I think that the mere fact that there's a sort of internally coherent nationalist narrative that on some level is historically understandable. I mean, I think that's true of a lot of national wars, oftentimes on multiple sides. I don't think, and this is the last thing I'll say on this and throw to you to kind of have the last word, and then I want to touch on a couple of other subjects before our time together ends, right? I don't think that that's enough to justify, to think that launching the war is justified.
Okay, Ben, first of all, I recoil at the word narrative. I've never liked that word, because it's as if to say, well, there's a Jewish narrative to the Nazi Holocaust and there's a Nazi narrative to the Nazi Holocaust.
Well, let's explore that. I mean, you were just talking about the weaponization of the memory of the Holocaust, that they have saying, look at what happened to us before, look at the traumatic event, never again, is so often used to justify Israel's crimes. I mean,
I'm going to beg you, even though I've hogged the show, I'm going to beg you to just hear me out.
Sure.
27 million people killed is not a narrative. That's a historical fact. Now, the number may be a little more, it may be a little less, it may be a little more, but nobody quarrels with the order of magnitude that we're talking about, somewhere in the area of 27 million people. Now, Ukraine has its corpses, and I have to acknowledge that. I don't agree it was a genocide, but something horrible happened during the during the 1930s in the Ukraine. I'm not going to dispute that. I'm not going to quarrel with it. The basic facts, as I say, it's not a narrative, it's a fact. Large numbers of people were killed. Whether it was 8 million or 1 million, I don't know. And I'm not saying that because I'm being glib. I've just not studied it closely enough to pass a judgment. We could just say large enough that it's a national trauma. No question in my mind about that. But Ukraine got its independence in 1991 or 1990 and 91. I can't remember right now. So if the former Soviet Union denied Ukraine its right to independence, I would say that's a real problem. They suffered enough. They have the right to their self-determination and their independence. They got their independence. So I'm respecting both historical facts. I won't call them narratives. I detest that word. I'm respecting, honoring, acknowledging, and not conceding, acknowledging both historical facts of what happened to Russia during the Soviet Union during World War II, and also what happened to Ukraine in the 1930s due to policies by Stalin. In my opinion, they weren't genocidal. The fact of the matter is that Ukraine had all the grain, and for Russia to industrialize, they need the grain to export it for industrial goods. How it was done? Totally unacceptable. I recognize that. But whether it was a determination to exterminate the Ukrainian people as a people, no, that's just not credible in my opinion. But to some extent, it's a semantic question. Large numbers of colossal numbers of Ukrainians were killed. So I acknowledge that fact, acknowledge what happened in Russia. They had their independence. Now, if Russia were threatening, denying Ukrainian independence in the interim between 1990 and today, I would say then Russia has a large amount of culpability about what happened. But Russia demanded two things: a neutral Ukraine aligned with neither a Western military bloc nor an Eastern military bloc, and some kind of autonomy rights for the Russian-speaking people in the Donbass. Neither of those demands in any way, shape, manner, or form in any way impinged on Ukrainian sovereignty. The decision of whether to join NATO could just have been made by NATO. NATO could say, thank you for the application, but we're not prepared to process it right now. That's all. That's not impinging on NATO's sovereignty.
I agree that it wouldn't.
If you apply to Rutgers University and they deny you entry because you didn't meet their entry criteria, you can't say that my sovereignty has been violated. That's a decision.
I just want to point out, Norm, that quite a bit of this is directed against things I haven't said. So that they have in fact, one of the first things I said is I agree NATO expansion was a bad idea. I agree that NATO not, seeking or allowing Ukrainian membership would be a good idea. That we agree on. The question that we disagree on, the central question, is whether
the threshold question.
Is whether the Russian invasion is justified. I'd also point out that,
what
I was saying about Ukrainian corpses was not actually about the famine. It was about the experience of the Nazi invasion. That just as that's part of the collective memory of Russians, that's part of the collective memory of Ukrainians. And they have and last point I just wanted to make is what I'm calling a narrative is not the devastation of World War II. What I'm calling a narrative is the linking of the devastation of World War II to the justification for present Russian foreign policy, much the same way that the Holocaust is not a narrative. But I think what you're correctly critiquing in the Holocaust industry is what I would call a narrative, which is the linking of the Holocaust to the justification for what Israel does. Oh, never again. Look at what happened to us before. We could never allow this to happen again. Therefore, we need to stay strong. Therefore, we need to do all of these things. That is a nationalist narrative. And similarly, I think that the linking of the trauma of World War II to the justification for the present kind of oligarchic gangster capitalist, government of Russia doing what it does in Ukraine. That's a narrative that's worth questioning. And I guess I'm very I guess I wonder what it adds to saying, American foreign policy has been wrong, that we shouldn't have sought, NATO expansion, that it's that right now, for the sake of both Russians and Ukrainians, we should be promoting de-escalation and peace negotiations, all of that stuff that we agree on, right? I'm wondering what it adds to that to say, and also launching this war was justified. I mean, what's the...
You could say, listen, you could say as a tactical consideration, and also to remain within the spectrum of at the extremes of respectable opinion, whereby you...
Well, I think I'm outside of the extremes of respectable opinion. I mean, I've spent the last year having people call me a Putin apologist because I want negotiations, but I do wonder if it makes it easier to discredit that perspective.
Because in my opinion, you can't apply in most situations, I should say you can apply in most situations a fairly hard and fast rule. So, for example, under international law, in particular, Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, Chapter 51 of the United Nations Charter, that you're only allowed to engage in war of self-defense if there is an imminent, basically an imminent, irreversible threat of attack. Either you are actually attacked or the attack is imminent, irreversible, and so forth, those criteria. So by that criteria, Russia fails. Was the rule that Charles de Gaulle, the head of state of France, he invoked in 1967 during the Arab-Israeli War. He says the party that's guilty of aggression is the one that fires the first shot.
Mm-hmm.
If you fire the first shot, you're guilty of aggression. And so by that standard, Russia is guilty of aggression. My view, however, is these kinds of hard and fast legal rules do not work in all situations. And it is my belief that if you factor in the lived experience of many Russian people and the desperate efforts of the Russian leadership to reach a reasonable diplomatic resolution of the conflict, and factor in the rejection by the US effectively, because many of the NATO countries like Germany and France would have gone for it if it weren't for the US rejection, the rejection of all these reasonable diplomatic initiatives by Russia. And if you factor in that the facts on the ground were not stable, but constantly shifting against Russia, to the point that there was a real fear that unless they did something now, there would be nuclear-tipped missiles on their border within 5 minutes range of Moscow. When you factor in all of those elements, it seems to me that they prevail over that Article 51 stipulation. That's how I reason it. But I have said, I can understand where others feel the threshold of provocations had not reached a sufficient enough degree as to warrant a Russian attack. I do, however, put a challenge to those who hold that view, like Professor Chomsky, even Aaron Mate, presumably yourself. My challenge is very simple. At what point in your mind do the provocations reach a degree, a magnitude, as to justify a Russian attack? Would you say that if missile launchers were placed on the border, but not yet the nuclear-tipped missiles, would that be sufficient warrant for a Russian attack?
No, just like I don't think that the United States had a right to interfere in Cuba because of missiles being placed there.
I don't think that situations aren't analogous at all. In the case of Cuba, the United States was preparing for an invasion of Cuba. At that very moment, the U.S. was preparing for an invasion of Cuba.
I think that that nuclear deterrence has, is obviously a horrible game to have to play. It's awful, but it has been, the track record, has, does suggest that countries being in a position to immediately wipe each other out. And by the way, I think by the time we're getting to 2023, the significance of exactly how close it is to the border has gotten just logistically has gotten just much less relevant to that threat. No, I don't think that justifies an invasion, and I'm also not. I'm also not very sympathetic to giving too much weight to lived experience when it over principles, which is, by the way, where we agree on the primary thesis of your book.
I find it very difficult, and it's actually, I don't want to dramatize it or be emotive, but it would be a complete betrayal of my parents' life experience to say that the lived experience of people like myself I said Putin is my age. And go look it up, Wikipedia. It's just 4 sentences about his childhood. It was all about people who were killed during the war. That lived experience has very deep resonances in me. I mean, to the point that it makes me kind of angry.
I mean, it also has very deep resonances for Ukrainian politicians who are worried about invasion by a foreign, by their neighbor and seek out military alliance. I mean, I think lived experience can't decide this question. I think there's too much of it going around.
As John Mearsheimer pointed out numerous occasions, up until like 2014, 15, nobody even talked about a threat posed by Russia. That was not even a subject of conversation. This whole thing about a threat posed by Russia has been just conjured out of thin air. There was no threat posed by Russia. Go back, look for evidence that the United States regarded Russia as an expansionist power trying to restore the holy Russian Empire. There was nothing like that.
I think that you'll find Ukrainians in the 90s and 2000s, did think they had something to worry about there. And I don't think that you need to go all the way to trying to restore the Russian Empire to have that be the case. And remember, my point here is not that it was, therefore a good idea for NATO to expand into the region. I mean, if I had my way, NATO would have, they could have done a joint ceremony the day that the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, where they also dissolved NATO. They have a
Benjamin, but then you have to ask yourself a basic question: why are they doing it? Why are they expanding? Why are they keeping moving east? If they didn't have hostile, aggressive intentions, why are they doing it? Is that a question that causes you to wonder? There was no desire on the part of Russia to come into collision with the West. They wanted to join the West. They had this crazy idea that now that the Cold War was over, there would be a continental-wide security system.
Mm-hmm.
Why did the West persist? Why does it keep pushing further and further to the east? Why does it get Romania, Poland? Forget about the Baltic states, which I can kind of get that point with the Baltic states. But then Russia said, Georgia and Ukraine, they are red lines for us. Georgia and Ukraine, those are red lines for us. Stop it already. Stop pushing us. Mm-hmm. And as Lavrov, the foreign minister, said a week before the attack on Ukraine, we've now reached a boiling point. You won't stop. So the question I have is, if they didn't pose a threat, if they were just innocent babes in the woods,
which, to be clear, nobody here has remotely implied.
Why are they doing this? Why are they doing this? There was a reasonable, easy solution. Yeah. Just say that Ukraine would have the same status as Austria did after World War II, that Finland had after World War II. They would be neutralized.
And again, just to reiterate one more time, mm-hmm. What you're expressing is the part that we agree on. They have a that would have been better. I mean, I certainly don't require any convincing that the U.S. military-industrial complex is dangerous. That there's always a very powerful hawkish lobby in Washington for feeding the coffers of military military contractors, for throwing around America's weight in the world, and then all of this makes the world profoundly more dangerous. And it would have been much better for that there are ample reasons to oppose U.S. policy in this regard. Whether those ample reasons to oppose U.S. policy add up to a reason to either in putting aside the pragmatic question, just in principle, whether they add up to a reason to endorse Russian policy is a different question. But I do want to just say this, Nora, this has been, so we're going a little bit over time here because we're having such an interesting conversation. I would really like it if you came back on the show, because there are things that I would really like to talk about with you that we've barely touched on today. Because we got, I'm very happy with all the conversation we had, but there's a lot that we didn't get to, and I would very much like it if there was a part 2.
I'm afraid my publisher is going to string me up from a lamppost, because every interview I do, I end up talking about Ukraine, and we never get to the book.
Well, I promise if you come back, we will get to the book, because I think that the sort of core subjects of the book about identity politics and the conflict between identity and class-based politics, about academic freedom, about sort of unhelpful moralism on the left, are all ones that are very close to my heart, and I think we could have an interesting follow-up that really is focused on those questions. But I also want to
happened on Glenn's program, by the way. Except
what's that?
The same thing happened on Glenn's program an hour ago, except we also went down the Mehdi Hassan, not Taibbi rabbit hole.
Sure. Well, at least that's a little bit closer, the Twitter files. But yeah, I want
to just make one last comment. And
yeah,
then
please. Yep.
The last comment is, I recently read an article that was sent to me on the Ukraine issue.
Yeah.
And it was very striking how it ended, the article. I don't know how much you know about World War II, but as you know, there was what was called the Stalin-Hitler or the Ribbentrop.
Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, sure.
Say that again?
Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Yeah, Molotov-Ribbentrop, and they called it Hitler-Stalin, whatever, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And for reasons which have always perplexed me, Stalin really believed that this pact was going to hold up. So when the Russians launched Operation Barbarossa to attack the Soviet Union was completely unprepared. Mm-hmm. And the first months were utterly devastating. The Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe swept into Russia and wiped out the Soviet defenses. And actually, had Hitler not embarked on the war of extermination, because in the East there was a war of extermination, had he not embarked on the war of extermination, probably could have won over a large number of the Russian people because of their experience, especially during the 1930s of collectivization. In any event, it was a catastrophe for Russia, either the first 2 months or the first 6 months. My memory's not perfect on that. Mm-hmm. The point being, Putin kept saying, I am not going to repeat Stalin's error. I'm not going to wait until it's too late. And again, to me, it's not at all surprising that when he's dealing with what seems to be a new threat of a formidable threat of foreign invasion, first Napoleon in 1812, the Nazis in the 20th century, and now a new threat, it's not surprising to me that his memory, and I don't think it's fake, because that's where my memory leaps, that his memory goes back, and he says, after we get off, I can send you the link to the article. I'm not going to repeat that mistake. The mistake being waiting until it's too late. And that's why the brief, the so to speak, gravamen of our conversation was this evening. At what point do you reach a threshold and you could say, okay, they now have the right to invade? And to me, that's for the people who are honest about the history, namely the 30 years of Russia, and Professor Chomsky, Mearsheimer, and all the rest, Jeffrey Sachs, Aromati, they'll all agree on that 30-year period. No disagreement there. The question is, has a threshold been crossed? And I say that the concerns, worries, and historical memory of the Russians are legitimate elements to factor into the equation. Remember,
sure, but you can equally say that the concerns and historical memories of Ukrainians, which include the same invasion, that they, that like Ukraine was invaded by the Nazis, and that memory of invasion and the presence of a neighboring far more powerful country provides a powerful incentive to seek out a military alliance. Now, I don't think that justifies Ukraine seeking out that military alliance, but I think it does make it more understandable. And I don't think that these kinds of considerations could decide this.
There's one big difference. There's no evidence that Russia was going to attack Ukraine. All the evidence was totally the contrary. They had no interest after 1991. Putin kept saying it. He said, I'm sorry we lost the Ukraine, but he said only a crazy person would try to recover it. However, I keep asking you the question, but not just you. If NATO had no aggressive designs, why did it persist?
I think that there's a difference between aggressive design.
NATO simply have said to Ukraine, not now. It would be perceived by Russia as too much of a provocation. Russia has not provoked you. Russia is simply calling for a neutralized Ukraine. So we, NATO, tell you, thank you for your application. Application rejected.
Sure. And again, you're circling back to the thing that we've said 20 times that we agree on.
Yeah, but you have
and there's also a difference between saying that there's some sense in which we're talking about aggressive intentions in terms of American dominance and hegemony in different parts of the world, and thinking that there was literally going to be an invasion of Russia. I'd also point out that if we are going to talk about such scenarios, I don't think it's true that there's nothing that could make a Ukrainian nationalist sincerely paranoid about the possibility of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I mean, I think certainly the annexation of Crimea, certainly Russia's support for separatists in the Donbass. These are things that I think could make a sincere Ukrainian nationalist worried about that, just like everything you're talking about could make a sincere Russian nationalist, worried about encirclement and the historical memories that triggers. But I don't think that any of this is dispositive. I think that they certainly the very, very strong default, from a left-wing perspective, a pro-working class perspective, should be a strong opposition to starting wars for all of the obvious reasons. What we know this does to ordinary people in these countries.
I have no problem with that.
We have a disagreement about whether that very strong default is overridden in this case.
Our disagreement is very simple, and then we're going to have to end at that. Not that I want the last word. The question is who started the war. I don't believe that the question of who fired the first shot is dispositive of who started the war. I think the war started if you want to go back to 1990, fine. But then if we don't want to go back to 1990, then we go back to 2014 and the coup in the Ukraine. And then the civil war that ensued for the next from 2014 to 2022, the civil war that ensued, about 17,000 people that were killed, and then the gradual, the incremental but inexorable incorporation of Ukraine de facto into NATO. That to me is when the war starts. That's our disagreement. I don't accept the applicability of Chapter 51 in the UN Charter that he who fires the first shot fired the war. I don't agree with that. I don't agree. If you look at the historical facts, that that's the correct a way to read the historical record. But that gets us very, very, very far away from how this whole thing started. Our whole conversation started by saying, this is the first time in my lifetime that there has been no left which has been arguing a position even critical of the current government. There has been no criticism, and that to me is a kind of a real eye opener. The extent to which these woke precincts like MSNBC are as
Well, that's not the
fanatically,
left. That's liberals.
well, they're as fanatically pro-war
Yeah,
as
liberals suck. That's not new information.
and at least there's some dissent, you could say, of a smarmy kind, but there's some dissent in the far right. And it's a very funny thing now when I want to turn on anything critical of the war, I have to look at people like Colonel McGregor.
Well, you should check out my articles in Jacobin. You'll see plenty of criticism there. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.